Batista.
Many of the people that attacked the barracks, a lot of whom were students, former students, workers, organizers, a lot of them were killed, tortured, killed. The ones that survived, including Fidel Castro and his brother, were sentenced to prison.
Castro was serving a 15-year sentence, but Ernesto was deeply impressed with his men. Unlike his Cuban friends, Ernesto was not committed to any cause or ideology, but the ouster of Guatemala's President Arbenz changes his view.
The first CIA-sponsored coup in Latin America took place in Guatemala in 1954. And essentially the army got scared and told Arbenz that he had to resign, and he did.
Castillo Armas is placed in power on June 27, 1954. He's seen by many as an American puppet. He begins arresting suspected communists and anyone connected to the old regime. Threatened with jail and possibly execution, Ernesto takes refuge at the Argentine embassy.
He came away convinced that the United States was, as he famously later called it, the enemy of humanity.
Jacobo Arbenz Guzman succumbed before the cold, premeditated aggression of the USA, hidden behind a smokescreen of continental propaganda.
Ernesto now considers himself a Marxist.
Communism seemed to offer a way forward and a ready-made ideology for the kind of new society that could rise from the ashes of the old. Ernesto Guevara, he left Guatemala a very radicalized individual, looking now for a revolution he could fight in.
September 1954. Like many other leftists, Ernesto heads for Mexico City, where former President Cardenas had successfully nationalized its oil fields in the 1930s.
Mexico had a historic standing as one of the countries on the flank of the United States who had stood up to Yankee imperialism at the turn of the century.
Ernesto reconnects with his Cuban friends and is introduced to Raul Castro. After serving 22 months in prison for his role in the Moncada siege, he has come to Mexico City to try and rebuild his older brother Fidel's organization.
They liked one another. He was a Marxist, as opposed to Fidel, who was still in prison.
Succumbing to international pressure, Batista releases Fidel Castro after having only served a 2-year sentence. He also heads for Mexico City.
This was a person who had tried to overthrow a dictatorship by the force of arms, and what a lot of people consider almost like a brazen, crazy attack on the Moncada barracks. Now he was exiled from his homeland, and guess what? He was organizing to try and go back and do the same thing.
Where Ernesto is reserved, serious, a communist, Fidel Castro was none of these things.
He'd gotten into the rough and ready politics of his day and had positioned himself as a patriot and nationalist. He was not yet a Marxist-Leninist.
August 1955. Eager to meet the man who had stirred such passion in his followers, Ernesto asks Raul to arrange a meeting. The meeting lasts all night.
Political occurrences having met Fidel Castro, a Cuban revolutionary, a young man, intelligent, very sure of himself, and of extraordinary audacity. I think there is a mutual sympathy between us.
They share many of the same ambitions and the same nemesis, the United States. Ernesto is invited to join the July 26th movement, named after the date of the Moncada siege. The only non-Cuban in the group, he signs on as troop doctor and is given the nickname Che.
Argentines say Che when they talk to one another. It's an old term meaning, hey, you. And so they began calling him Che.
Hilda had been left behind in Guatemala. She now joins Che.
Hilda announced that she was pregnant, which came as a bit of a blow. But curiously, he decided to do the right thing, and he married her.
Soon after the birth of his daughter Hildita, Che pours all his energy into the movement and the big push for Cuba.
Almost immediately, he was off for long periods of time in a ranch outside Mexico City, where they trained militarily. He turned out to be one of the best shots in the group.
But word soon gets out, and Che, along with Fidel Castro and most of the July 26 movement members in the city, are arrested and detained. They're in jail for a month. Upon their release, the movement goes underground. Fidel Castro continues with his plans of overthrowing Batista and purchases a beat-up old boat for $15,000, appropriately named the Granma, to take his small army of 82 from Mexico to Cuba. They anticipate a 5-day journey. Che writes a letter to his mother informing her of his actions. Hilda is to mail it if he should die in battle.
In essence, saying his last goodbyes to Hilda and his young daughter, that if he survived, he would see them again. But you know, the revolution called.
2 a.m. on the morning of November 25, 1955. 82 men board the Granma.
With our lights extinguished, we left the port of Tuxpan amid an infernal mess of men and all sorts of material. Fidel's words began to take on reality. In 1956, we shall be free or we shall be martyrs.
His cause was revolution in Latin America. The next objective was Cuba, to liberate Cuba. And he had ceased to call himself Ernesto Guevara. He had become Che.
"27-year-old Che Guevara has joined Fidel Castro and 80 others on an armed expedition to overthrow Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. On November 25, 1955, the small army boards an old boat named the Granma and heads for Havana. 90 miles off the Florida coast, the island of Cuba is enjoying benefits from its booming tourist industry.
Havana was the whorehouse of the Caribbean. It was a place where Americans went on dirty weekends. There were live sex shows, showgirls. It was full of prostitutes, drugs.
It was a carnival atmosphere to which a lot of American tourists flocked. And there were some very positive aspects of it, but there was another Cuba, and the other Cuba was a Cuba that was basically run militarily by dictatorship.
Although the Eisenhower administration supports Batista, most Cubans consider him a ruthless dictator.
Fulgencio Batista was as much of a thug as ever governed a Latin American country. He was somebody who was considered beholden to U.S. economic interests, to the interests of the U.S. mafia in Cuba.
The 7-day passage aboard the Granma has been turbulent.
The entire boat took on an aspect both ridiculous and tragic. Men with anguished faces, holding their stomachs, some with their heads in pockets, others lying in the strangest positions, immobile, their clothing soiled with vomit.
It was an unmitigated disaster. They lost their bearings, they lost a man overboard, later saved him. When they eventually reached the coast of Cuba, they landed in the wrong place.
They arrive in Cuba 2 days late and in broad daylight. As the old boat approaches Las Coloradas Beach, they hit a sandbar.
Foundered and had to stumble ashore into a marsh.
Before the troops have a chance to regroup, Batista's Air Force attacks and sends Che and the rest of Fidel Castro's men fleeing.